Okay, so picture this. You know that awesome feeling when you finally solve a problem that just seemed impossible. Now take that feeling and apply it to something as huge as environmental pollution. And then imagine that very victory is in jeopardy. Today we're going to do a deep dive into something that could actually happen. Acid rain might be making a comeback here in the U.S.
Yeah, that's right. It's something we really have to look at, this possible resurgence of acid rain in the United States. And we're focusing on this really insightful article from The Guardian. It features an interview with Dr. Gene Likens, and he's been studying this for a long, long time.
We're talking about the Dr. Gene Likens who discovered acid rain in North America, right? Back in the 1960s. I mean, that's a while ago. He must have some serious credibility when it comes to this.
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Likens' work is foundational. His perspective is so valuable, especially now. And what we're trying to do today is really understand the whole story of acid rain, how it started, the amazing efforts to stop it, and why it might come back. This is a big deal, because it affects ecosystems, it affects our health. So staying informed about this is really important.
So, acid rain, where did it all begin? Take us back to that moment, that aha moment, when Dr. Likens realized what was going on.
All right, so it's 1963. Dr. Likens is up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. He's collecting rainwater, like scientists do. And what he finds is shocking. The rainwater is like 100 times more acidic than normal. That's not a small difference. It's huge. And so naturally, he's like, what's causing this?
And I bet it wasn't just some weird New Hampshire weather, right? Yeah. This was something much bigger.
You got it. It took years, but Dr. Likens and other scientists finally figured it out. It was pollution. Mainly sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides coming from coal-fired power plants. And guess where most of these plants were? The Midwest.
The industrial heartland. So these pollutants were like hitching a ride on the wind, going from the Midwest all the way to the Northeast.
Exactly. It's like, how water and some metals can react and form rust? Well, it's kind of similar here. These pollutants up in the air reacted with water and oxygen. The result, sulfuric acid and nitric acid. And then, boom, they come down as acid rain.
And by the 1980s, the effects were just awful, right? Like really bad.
It was devastating, really. Lakes and streams got so acidic that fish and amphibians couldn't live in them anymore. The soil, the lifeblood of forests and plants, was being stripped of important nutrients, calcium, magnesium, you name it. And even buildings and monuments were being eaten away by the acid. By 1980, most of the rain in the eastern U.S. was 10 times more acidic than normal. That's a huge difference.
It's hard to imagine lakes without fish just because the rain's messed up.
You mentioned public outcry, so I guess people were pretty freaked out.
Oh, yeah, they were worried. And for good reason. Newspaper cartoons even showed umbrellas dissolving in the rain. It was a powerful image, one that really stuck with people. And that public pressure, along with all the research from Dr. Likens and others, finally pushed politicians to do something. It just shows you how important it is for people to be aware and understand the science behind these issues.
And then came the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990. A real success story. A win for the environment.
That's right. This was a big moment. Both Democrats and Republicans in Congress really got behind these amendments. They were specifically aimed at tackling acid rain, using some clever tools like a cap-and-trade system for sulfur dioxide coming from power plants. And President George H.W. Bush, a Republican, signed it into law. He even said, every city in America should have clean air. It shows you how much agreement there was on this back then.
It really does seem like a time when environmental protection wasn't such a political football. And these amendments actually worked, right? Things actually got better.
They were super effective. Because of the regulations, acid rain went way down. In the White Mountains, where Dr. Likens first made his discovery, acidity has dropped by like 85% since the peak in the 1970s.
Huh.
That's incredible. It shows that even tough environmental problems can be solved when we make the right choices.
85%. That's amazing. So, problem solved, right? Acid rain's a thing of the past.
Well, there's a catch, Dr. Likens. He's got this warning, this important point he makes. You see, even though the rain is less acidic now, the damage to the soil in a lot of those areas, it's still there. It's like when you have an injury, even if you feel better, the damage might still be there underneath, making you weaker. So if acid rain comes back, those areas are going to be hit extra hard. It's a good reminder that environmental recovery takes time.
That's a sobering thought. And this leads us to what's happening now, the part that really worries Dr. Likens. The threat of rolling back all those regulations.
Exactly. The Trump administration's EPA, they started trying to get rid of or weaken a lot of environmental rules, something like 31 of them. The EPA administrator at the time, he actually called it a dagger straight into the heart of the climate change religion. That tells you something about the thinking behind these changes, right?
Well, and Dr. Likens thinks these rollbacks, especially the ones for emissions from power plants, cars, and trucks, could bring back acid rain. How does that work?
Well, it's regulations that limit how much sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides those things can release that are being targeted. If you weaken those rules, you basically get more of those pollutants going up into the air, and that's the recipe for acid rain. It's like going back to the very beginning of the problem. Dr. Likens is very clear about this. He said, "I'm very worried that might happen. It's certainly not impossible that it could happen." And this is coming from the guy who's been studying this for decades.
It's crazy. And didn't something happen with Dr. Likens' own research?
Oh, yeah. The Trump administration cut funding for Dr. Likens' long-term project at Hubbard Brook, the one that's been collecting rainwater data since 1963. That kind of data, collected over so many years, it's crucial to understanding what's happening in the environment. By cutting the funding, you're basically flying blind. You can't see if the problem is coming back.
And it's not just acid rain, right? The EPA itself estimated that these rollbacks could have a pretty big impact on people's health.
Yeah, that's true. The EPA actually did an analysis of all these regulations, and they found that rolling them back could mean thousands of extra deaths and a bunch of health problems, like heart and lung diseases, all because of increased air pollution. So even though the goal was to help the economy by getting rid of regulations, the cost to people's health could be really high.
It's like they wanted to boost the economy, but it might come at a huge cost to the environment and to people.
It's important to consider other opinions, though, right? The article mentions some experts who have different takes on all this. Totally. We need to look at things from all sides. So there's William Riley. He was the EPA administrator when the 1990 Clean Air Act was passed. He definitely thinks the Trump administration went in a totally different direction, like going back to a time before the EPA, a time when the air might be unbreathable and rivers could catch fire. Pretty scary, huh?
Yeah, that does sound scary. But I thought he wasn't as worried about acid rain coming back full force.
You're right. He thinks things are different now because we're using less coal. Coal was the big culprit for sulfur dioxide, the stuff that caused a lot of the acid rain. Now natural gas is becoming more popular, it's cleaner, and he thinks that even if pollution goes up overall, natural gas won't cause as much acid rain. But he doesn't deny that nitrogen oxide emissions, which are also part of the problem, could get worse and contribute to acid rain. So it's not all clear-cut.
So maybe we won't have the exact same acid rain crisis as before, but other kinds of pollution could still become a bigger problem. What do other scientists think?
There's Richard Peltier. He's an environmental scientist. He thinks acid rain could come back, but probably more slowly than before. He even says it's not like you'll wake up tomorrow and it will be 1975 in terms of acid rain, but we could move in that direction. It's a good way to think about it. He's also worried about this growing distrust in science, this idea that scientists are corrupt or bad guys. That's dangerous and just not true. We need to trust the science if we're going to tackle these problems.
I think the distrust of science is a really big problem that goes way beyond just acid rain. The article also mentions a soil scientist, Murray McBride. What was his perspective on all this?
Murray McBride was really focused on the possibility of a major rollback in the rules about sulfur dioxide. As we talked about before, sulfur dioxide is a key ingredient for sulfuric acid, which is a big part of acid rain. He doesn't think we'll see the same levels of acid rain unless there are huge changes to these regulations. But he admits, given what's been happening, that kind of rollback is definitely possible. It makes you realize how important it is to pay attention to what's going on with these specific pollutants.
So it seems like everyone agrees that weakening pollution controls could be bad for the environment and people's health, even if they don't all agree on how fast acid rain might return.
That's right. And if you think about it from the perspective of someone who wants to understand the long-term effects of what our leaders decide, the story of acid rain is like a perfect example. We figured out a big environmental problem, did the research, came up with solutions that worked, and now we might undo all that. It shows how important it is to keep working at protecting the environment, even when things seem okay.
Dr. Likens really seems to care about this, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's really passionate about it. He wants his kids and grandkids to have clean air, clean water, and healthy soil. It's a basic thing, wanting a good environment for future generations. It makes you think about our responsibility to those who come after us.
Of course. What about the EPA? What was their response to all of this?
The EPA spokesperson in the article said that the U.S. can protect the environment and have a strong economy at the same time. They called the rollbacks the biggest deregulation in American history. And they said it would make America's energy production stronger, reduce our reliance on foreign fossil fuels, and get rid of unnecessary regulations. But they didn't actually answer the questions about acid rain coming back or the potential health risks that their own analysis had identified. That's kind of weird, don't you think?
It's definitely interesting. It makes you wonder how much weight they're giving to environmental protection compared to economic growth.
Absolutely. It's a tough balance to find. But it's important to ask these questions and think about the long-term consequences of deregulation.
So to sum it all up, we had a huge environmental problem, acid rain. Scientists figured it out, the public got involved, and bipartisan policies were put in place that actually worked. Now, those hard-won victories are being threatened by changes in regulations aimed at boosting the economy.
That's a good summary. Dr. Likens, the guy who first brought this whole thing to light, is warning us again. Other experts might have slightly different views on how fast acid rain could return, but they're all worried about weakening pollution controls. It shows that we can't just sit back and relax. We have to keep working to protect the environment.
This deep dive into acid rain really gets you thinking. What does it mean when important research, like Dr. Likens' project, loses its funding? How should we balance the economy with the environment and our health in the long run? And how much should science influence the decisions our leaders make?
These are big questions, and they're not easy to answer. But the story of acid rain shows us that environmental problems don't just disappear. They can come back if we're not careful. And we need to keep using science to guide our decisions. The story of acid rain is a reminder that science, policy, and our lives are all connected.
For those of you studying for your UPSC exams, this whole thing with acid rain is a really good example of environmental damage, how different policies can work or not work, and how important it is to have good scientific research to guide our choices. Think about how these lessons, both the good and the bad, apply to India's environment and the goals of sustainable development. If you like this deep dive, please hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want to learn more, check out the original article in The Guardian.